In a quiet corner of Avignon, where the streets narrowed and the stone walls held the dust of forgotten parades, a man named Gervais worked alone. His study overlooked a courtyard where children no longer played, and the only sounds that reached him were the distant bells of the cathedral and the scratching of his quill. The days passed slowly here, but that was how he liked them. Quiet, dependable, full of paper and thought. Gervais was a scholar of modest reputation, once a teacher of canon law. His students had long since moved on to other cities, some to bishoprics, some to courts. He had remained. Books suited him better than courts. And he had always been drawn not to the clean edges of church history, but to the years when the seams came undone. That evening, as the wind rattled the wooden shutters, Gervais stood before a tall cabinet and removed a worn folio, blank and waiting. He placed it gently on the desk, lit a fresh candle, and warmed his fingers at the fire. Then he sat, picked up his quill, and dipped it in the ink. His hands, steady though aged, moved with care. He had thought long about which story to write next. Not kings, not wars. Those had their place in chronicles and songs. This was different. It was about a wound that had once run through the body of the church. A wound that had festered quietly, far from the battlefield, and had divided more than just cardinals and cities. It had split parishes, families, hearts. The Western Schism. He had chosen this story because it still echoed in the corners of cathedrals, in the prayers that stumbled over names no longer spoken. Because though the schism had ended, the memory of it still lingered like smoke after a fire. It was a story people preferred to forget. He would not let it be forgotten. "This is the story," he wrote, "of a man named Anselm, who lived through the long years when the church had more than one voice, and each voice cried out alone." The quill paused, the fire crackled, and in the stillness Gervais listened to the silence. Then he wrote on, "Anselm was born on the edge of Florence, in a house where parchment hung from wooden beams and the smell of ink clung to everything. His father was a parchment maker, quiet, careful, and patient. From him, Anselm learned the value of precision, of soft hands and steady breath. Vellum was not paper, it was skin. You treated it with respect. He grew up among scraps, bits of sermons, prayers, and letters that other men had discarded. His father saved the pieces with clean Latin and gave them to Anselm, who would sit in the warm dust beside the workbench, sounding out the syllables. That was how he learned to read, not from a teacher, but from the waste of priests and scribes. Florence in those days was loud with trade and full of worry. The plague still haunted memory, even if its breath had retreated. Some blamed the Jews, some the stars, and many simply prayed harder. Anselm did not yet understand what the city feared. He only knew it watched the church closely. When he was 15, the friars came preaching through the streets, their sandals slick with rain. They shouted that the Pope had returned to Rome. Not a Frenchman now, not a distant shadow in Avignon, but home again in the city of Peter. The people cheered, some wept. Bells rang from the cathedral and echoed through every square. But not everyone celebrated. In the back of the parchment shop, an older scribe named Marco muttered into his beard, "They will tear the church apart before they fix it." Anselm asked what he meant. The man only shook his head and said, "When pride and fear walk together, truth gets pushed into the corner." Then, not even a year later, the friars returned with new proclamations. The Pope, Gregory XI, had died. Rome demanded a Roman Pope. The cardinals, frightened by angry crowds outside the conclave, chose an Italian named Bartolomeo Prignano. He became Urban VI. At first there was relief, but that didn't last. Urban turned out to be no puppet. He scolded the cardinals, accused them of corruption, and began sweeping away their privileges. He appointed new cardinals, loyal only to him. The old guard, most of them French, called his election false. They had chosen under threat, they claimed. They left Rome in secret and gathered in Fondi, where they declared Urban deposed, and elected a new pope, Clement VII. That was the moment it began. One pope in Rome, one in Avignon, each claiming the other was the heretic, each demanding loyalty, each with his own court, his own seal, his own chain of excommunications. And in Florence, young Anselm sat in a dark shop, copying a letter for a bishop and listening to the city hold its breath. At 18, Anselm was no longer a boy, though he still looked like one. He worked now in a copyist's shop near the river, his fingers always stained with ink, his posture bent from long hours of quiet labor. He copied sermons, proclamations, legal notices, whatever came through the door. And lately, more and more of it bore the names of popes, plural, Rome or Avignon, Urban or Clement, the names repeated like a chant with no answer. One week, a friar brought a parchment with Urban's seal. The next, a merchant arrived with a letter from a bishop loyal to Clement. The shopkeeper, caught in the middle, shrugged and said, "We serve ink, not truth." But Anselm wanted to understand. What he heard in the streets troubled him. People argued outside churches, not about salvation or sin, but about legitimacy. Priests hesitated at the altar when they came to the name of the Pope in their prayers. Some skipped it, others whispered both names, just to be safe. Then, one afternoon, as the sun dropped low over the city, an old copyist who had worked alongside Anselm for years said the word for the first time, schism. It was spoken quietly, like a confession. Anselm looked up from his work. "What does that mean?" The man set down his pen and answered, "It means the church has cracked down the middle, and no one knows how deep the break goes." Anselm finished his task that night, rolled up the scroll, and didn't return the next morning. He had no plan, only a feeling that he needed to see what lay beyond the city. He packed a small bag, tucked a psalter into his coat, and set out on the road to Rome. The journey took him through hills and olive groves, across muddy roads and quiet villages. He slept in stables, under trees, and once in the back of a bell tower where no one noticed him. He shared meals with travellers and asked questions of everyone, monks, merchants, even beggars who loitered near church doors. In one town, he saw 2 churches on opposite ends of the square. One prayed for Urban, the other for Clement. Children from each side threw stones across the market. Anselm watched and wondered how such a division could grow from men who called themselves holy. When he finally reached Rome, the city overwhelmed him. It was grand, yes, but broken in places. The streets smelled of incense and sewage. Its people were sharp with worry. Urban VI still reigned there, but his reputation had withered. They said he punished cardinals without trial, struck down critics without cause. His sermons were full of rage, Some said he was mad. Others said he was cleansing a corrupt church. Anselm watched, listened, and wrote everything down in a small book he kept hidden under his coat. But he did not stay long. The tension in the city clung to his skin like dust. He turned north once more, toward Avignon, toward the other pope, toward more questions. He travelled slowly, taking the long roads through Burgundy and into the foothills of the Alps. Spring deepened around him, the vines returned to the hillsides, and the rivers grew fat with melted snow. But even in the smallest villages, the weight of the schism clung to doorways and altar rails. Some places bore its mark like a scar. In one mountain town he passed 2 churches that had once shared a priest. Now they sat cold and locked, their flocks split between loyalties. In another he saw a bulletin nailed to a tree. One pope declared the other excommunicated again. The ink was fresh. In a quiet town near Lyon, Anselm met a priest tending a vegetable garden behind a half-collapsed rectory. The man greeted him with warm bread and no questions. They shared a meal of boiled roots and cold wine. As dusk settled, Anselm asked the question he always asked. "Which pope do you follow?" The priest wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Neither. I serve Christ. The rest is noise." They sat in silence for a long time after that, listening to the soft wind through the bare vines. A few days later, Anselm stayed in a Benedictine monastery high above the Rhone. The monks there had chosen loyalty to Rome. Their prayers named Urban VI. Their abbot spoke carefully, but with conviction. "Avignon is a court of courtiers," he said. "Rome is hard, yes, but it is rooted." Still, even in that cloistered place there was unease. After the evening meal, one young monk confessed, "We used to pray for the Pope. Now we pray for peace." Anselm wrote that down in the dark, sitting by a narrow window where the moonlight touched the edge of his page. Farther along the road in Geneva, he found noise again. Students from Paris, many younger than him, argued in the candlelit corners of taverns. They quoted Augustine and Aquinas, flung names like hammers. Clement, Urban, Boniface. They spoke of conciliarism, of royal influence, of the weakness of canon law. They debated with the fire of people who believed reason could still cure what was broken. Anselm sat with them, drank thin ale, and listened. One night, a student named Philippe turned to him suddenly and said, "The church is sick, and none of the popes are doctors." It was said as a joke, but the others didn't laugh. By the time Anselm reached Paris, he was weary in his bones. The city was full of scholars and clerics, each with a different answer and no clear solution. Some blamed the cardinals, others pointed to the kings who pulled the strings. And yet, amid the lectures and letters, the arguments and excommunications, one truth returned again and again. No one could agree on what to do. And still, across the land, the people waited. In the chapels and the fields, in cities and in villages, they waited, watching their altars, listening for guidance, and hearing only silence. Paris welcomed no one gently, least of all a tired traveller with no title. But Anselm arrived with the rhythm of the roads still in his step, and the quiet persistence of a man who had learned to observe more than he spoke. The city overwhelmed him at first. Its size, its smell, its layers of argument carved into its very stones. It was a place of words, Words filled the streets, the classrooms, the churches. Posters and proclamations clung to walls like ivy. In the University of Paris, the finest minds of Christendom argued from behind pulpits and beneath vaulted ceilings. Scholars stood before students and presented treatises on which Pope had been canonically elected, which council held authority, and whether a pope who erred could be judged by men. Anselm sat quietly at the back of the lecture halls, his hands cold from the stone benches. He filled pages with the words of others, but in the margins he made small marks, notes not of answers, but of questions yet unanswered. In a cramped chapel behind a crumbling inn, he met Father Hugo, a priest with a limp and a soft voice. The man had once served as a scribe in Avignon, but had left when the politics began to twist Scripture into knots. Now he led a small flock who were tired of arguments and just wanted bread and blessing. One evening, over a simple meal of onion stew and dry bread, Hugo looked across the table and said, "There is too much pride in this quarrel, too many men trying to hold the sky in their own hands. The Church cannot heal until its shepherds learn to kneel." Anselm wrote those words down with care. He stayed in Paris through the winter. He helped Hugo copy old homilies and repair the chapel roof. When it snowed, he brought hot water to the sick. When it rained, he read psalms aloud by candlelight. It was not grand work, but it was steady. It grounded him in a way the debates of cardinals never had. Still, the questions did not leave him. Every night as he folded his cloak near the fire, he would stare into the flames and wonder how the voice of the Church, the voice that had once felt like the breath of heaven, could have become so confused, so fractured. By early spring, the first flowers pushed up from the thawed ground. The city began to hum again, and Anselm, restless once more, packed his satchel and slipped away before sunrise. Hugo gave him a quiet blessing and a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "You won't find your answer," Hugo said gently, "but perhaps you'll find the shape of it." Anselm said nothing. He nodded, shouldered his bag, and walked on. South again, toward the councils, toward the mountains, toward what came next. The road turned stony as Anselm moved south, the low plains giving way to hills, and the hills to snow-laced passes. He travelled with merchants at times, with monks on pilgrimage, and sometimes alone, his thoughts as heavy as his feet. Every town brought some new edict, some new call for obedience to one pope or the other, but fewer people were listening. In Avignon, the cardinals still met in fine halls. In Rome, Urban VI was dead, replaced by Boniface IX, and yet the schism did not end. It deepened, dug in like an old root. Each pope excommunicated the other, and those who followed them were caught in the middle, weary of the noise, but afraid to fall silent. Anselm passed through a town where the bells no longer rang on Sundays. "Until the Church finds one shepherd," the local priest had said, "we shall wait like sheep in the dark." In Carcassonne, he stayed for a season with a family of weavers. The father had once made vestments for a bishop. Now he refused the Church any cloth. "Let them mend their own robes," he spat. "They know not how to wear them." It was in that town that Anselm first heard of murmurs from scholars and preachers, murmurs of councils, not just conclaves of cardinals behind closed doors, but wider gatherings, clergy, academics, even princes, calling for reform and unity through consensus, not decree. He listened to a sermon given by a travelling friar, whose voice cracked from exhaustion but burned with purpose. "No man can serve two popes," the friar declared, "and no pope who loves his flock would tear it in half." The people listened, not with shouts or cheers, but with stillness, as if they too were waiting for someone else to say it first. That night, Anselm wrote in his notebook beneath a borrowed blanket. He wrote not what the friar had said, but what the silence afterward had meant. He moved on again, always moving, toward Pisa. Rumors began to build like storm clouds. Bishops from across Europe were gathering, delegates from universities, messengers from kings. All would meet and decide. Anselm didn't know what they would do, but for the first time in years, he heard something new in people's voices. Not fear, not anger, hope. It was a fragile thing, hope, like wax near a flame. But it was there, and Anselm followed it, step by step, through vineyards and olive groves, toward the city that was becoming the center of the world. Pisa was a city of stone and sunlight, perched between hills and the sea. When Anselm arrived, it was not the architecture he noticed, but the tension. The city was full, more than full. Delegates had come from across Europe, bishops, scholars, notaries, even a few nobles dressed in velvet that barely concealed their weariness. The air buzzed with questions, and the streets hummed with anticipation. Anselm found lodging with a group of theology students, sleeping on straw between bookshelves and crates of ink. None of them spoke much during the day. At night they whispered about history. The council had begun. Urban VI had died, and Boniface IX after him. Now in Rome sat Gregory XII. In Avignon, Clement VII was dead, replaced by Benedict XIII. Both still claimed legitimacy, but the council at Pisa had called them both illegitimate, declaring that the schism could not end until both men laid down their titles. And so, in 1409, the council did what many hoped and others feared. It elected a third pope, Alexander V. For a moment there was applause. For a moment there was relief. But when Gregory and Benedict refused to resign, when they each excommunicated the new pope in turn, the cheers turned to silence. Now there were three. Anselm sat in a cathedral pew as Alexander was welcomed in Pisa. He watched the bishops raise their hands in blessing, but in his heart he felt only the slow closing of a door. That winter, Alexander died unexpectedly, and in his place came Baldassare Cossa, now Pope John the 23rd. Another name, another throne, another seal pressed into wax. Anselm had once believed he was walking toward a resolution, but now it seemed he was only walking in circles, around the same wound, deeper each year. He left Pisa with no farewell, stepping out before dawn with a satchel that felt heavier than it had before. Anselm made his way east, across the plains of Lombardy and through the towns of the Veneto. The air was cooler now. Letters passed from hand to hand, scribbled with updates from the pulpits of Europe. Some called John the 23rd a savior, others a usurper. The confusion had only grown. 3 popes, 3 courts, 3 sets of decrees, excommunications and demands. It was no longer a question of who was right. It had become a question of how the church could survive. In a small village near Mantua, Anselm passed a church that stood open but empty. On the altar, the candles were unlit. The people had stopped coming, the caretaker said. They do not know who listens any more. Rumors of a new council began to gather like thunder, not in Italy this time, but in the German lands. A city called Constance, nestled near a great lake, was calling the church to gather again. The Holy Roman Emperor himself, Sigismund, had placed his weight behind it. And unlike Pisa, this time there would be no tolerating refusal. Anselm journeyed north, passing through Innsbruck and following the cold rivers into Swabia. It was winter again, and snow clung to his cloak as he walked. Constance greeted him with banners and watchmen at the gates. The city was transformed, inns full, halls lit, and voices in every tongue. Cardinals, ambassadors, theologians, scribes, envoys from France and England, Bohemia and Poland. Even merchants selling roasted chestnuts in the street spoke of papal depositions and heresy trials. Anselm found lodging in a stable loft and watched history unfold from rooftops and cathedral steps. John the 23rd arrived first, in regal dress and guarded pride. Gregory the 12th, to many surprise, sent word that he was willing to abdicate if the council proved true. Benedict the 13th remained in distant Aragon, refusing even to attend. He declared the council invalid. No one expected him to yield. But something had changed. There was resolve now, among bishops and kings alike. This council would not end in compromise. Anselm kept his journal close and listened more than he spoke. The city pulsed with urgency, and somewhere beneath it, the smallest breath of hope began to rise again. The Council of Constance was unlike anything Anselm had ever seen. Its sessions filled the cathedral and spilled into the streets. Each morning he watched robed officials cross the squares with fur-lined hoods and heavy scrolls tucked beneath their arms. Some moved with solemn purpose, others moved like men chasing power before it vanished. John the 23rd's confidence soon began to crack. When the council pressed him to resign for the good of unity, he wavered, then fled. Disguised and mounted, he vanished into the night. But Constance did not splinter. They brought him back. The council stripped him of his title. They tried him, deposed him, and imprisoned him. Anselm saw the crowds lining the streets as the judgment was announced. Some shouted, some wept, but most stood in silence, as if watching a fever break after years of illness. Next came Gregory the 12th. His resignation, though more measured, was no less historic. In a carefully orchestrated act, he stepped down willingly, offering legitimacy to the council that had deposed the others. Anselm, standing in a shadowed gallery of the cathedral, watched the ceremony unfold. The moment was quiet, dignified, and full of the weight of years. Benedict the 13th, in the end, held out alone. From his fortress in Peniscola he declared all the rest heretics. But by now even his few supporters had slipped away. His voice rang out, but no one answered. And so, after 39 long years of confusion, the Church was ready to speak with one voice again. The cardinals met in conclave, this time under the broad support of Christendom. The bells rang across Constance on the day the decision was made. White smoke rose above the rooftops, and the name was spoken. Martin V, a Roman, a man of learning but not of pride. Anselm stood among the crowd when the new pope stepped forward, not in triumph but in steadiness. The long division had ended, and yet as the people around him rejoiced, Anselm felt something stranger than joy. He felt quiet. Martin V's procession through the streets of Constance was solemn, not grand. He raised no banners of victory. He issued no condemnations. The schism was over, but the wounds it left behind would take more than unity to heal. Anselm remained in the city for several weeks after the election, watching how slowly the dust settled. The council still met, turning its attention to other matters: reform, heresy, discipline. There were trials, there were flames. The memory of Johann Hus hung heavy in the air, though few dared speak his name aloud. The people hoped, but carefully. Too many times they had placed their trust in voices that had risen, only to curse each other from pulpits. Too many altars had named too many popes. Martin travelled to Rome eventually. The church followed him. The curia was rebuilt, the offices restored. The cardinals returned to one college. The masses resumed. But Anselm did not follow. Instead, he wandered west again, his steps slower now, though his back remained straight. He passed through towns that had once torn themselves in half over papal allegiance. Some were rebuilding, others bore scars in empty pews and shuttered chapels. In one village he met a boy learning to write the name of the new pope. The boy asked him, "Were there ever two popes, really?" Anselm smiled and said, "There were three." The boy blinked, confused. "But that's not possible." "No," Anselm agreed, "it wasn't." That night he camped beneath the stars and took out the final pages of his journal. The ink bled slightly in the cool air. He did not try to summarize what he had seen. He simply wrote what he had always written, what people said, and what silence meant. Years passed. Anselm returned at last to Florence, older than most remembered, quieter than ever. His father's shop was gone, replaced by a wine merchant. The streets had changed, but the bells still rang the same. He found work in a small scriptorium, copying texts for friars who could no longer see clearly. They asked him few questions. He gave few answers. In the evenings, he sat by a narrow window and read through the pages he had once written on the road. Notes, sketches, scraps of conversations that had weathered the long years of walking and waiting. One winter, sensing time pressing close, he bundled the pages together and sent them to a name he remembered hearing once, long ago. A scholar in Avignon, one who studied the years when the church came undone. Gervais. The bundle arrived months later, carried by a pilgrim who knew neither the sender nor the weight of what he bore. Gervais received it in silence. He untied the string, unfolded the parchment, and read by candlelight long into the night. He read of papal proclamations and deserted churches, of monks who prayed for peace instead of popes, of councils, arguments, and betrayals, and of a single man, walking, listening, bearing witness, not to victory or defeat, but to the ache of a church that had lost its own reflection. When the last page had been turned, Gervais closed the folio, pressed his fingers to the parchment, and whispered a prayer, not for the popes, nor for the councils, but for Anselm, wherever he had finally laid down his pen. Then he reached for a fresh sheet. This, he wrote, was the story of a man who walked through the broken years of the church and who chose not sides, but memory.